So today, the United States launched a trade war against Canada.
If the U.S. does go ahead with this colossally stupid, self-mutilating plan to impose tariffs on Canada, then we need to be resolute in our response, dollar for dollar retaliation, surgical, targeted, exerting the maximum pain so that the tariffs are lifted as soon as possible.
So when the prime ministers and the premiers are saying stuff like we can match dollar for dollar, that is a blatant lie, a blatant misinformation that has no basis in fact. It has no support in empirical data and economic theory. There's nothing to back it. Zip, nil, zip, scrap shit, nothing.
And to see this escalation is so disappointing, so damaging initially to American consumers and American businesses who buy Canadian goods and raw materials. But then now with the counter tariffs, it's also going to be harmful to Canadian.
But Donald, they point out that even though you're a very smart guy, this is a very dumb thing to do.
I don't start a tariff war, but we're going to win this tariff war.
We can't win a trade war.
Do not boo the American national anthem. And to my American friends, do not boo the Canadian national anthem. That's crossing the line.
And yeah, we're probably going to keep booing the American anthem.
A 25% tariff was imposed on Canada on the morning of March 4th, prompting an immediate and fiery response from Canadian politicians. Prime Minister Trudeau announced that Canada will retaliate with 25% tariff on $155 billion worth of American goods. Ontario Premier Doug Ford went even further by removing all American alcohol from the LCBO shelf and the cancellation of the Starlink contract in Ontario.
Starting today, LCBO, the largest purchaser of alcohol in the world, will begin removing U.S. products from its store shelves.
He warned that if Trump administration escalate with more tariff, Ontario would impose a 25% surcharge on the electricity it exports to the U.S.
If the Trump administration falls through on any more tariffs, we will immediately apply a 25% surcharge on the electricity we export. We will not hesitate to shut off their power as well.
In response, President Donald Trump took to the Truth Social, posting, and I quote, "Please explain to Governor Trudeau of Canada that when he puts on a retaliatory tariff on the U.S., our reciprocal tariff will immediately increase by a like amount. This exchange raises the stakes of a potential trade war between the two nations." To unpack the implications of this escalating trade conflict, I'm joined by Vincent Geloso, economist and economics professor at George Mason University. Until now, almost all politicians repeating the same thing, an announced counter-tariff. Vincent Geloso have mentioned that this is a really bad decision, so I asked him to explain why.
I'll say a few things first. I want to give credit to the two politicians I've seen who have said that counter tariffs are bad, and they are bad. It's and that was not on my bingo card for 2025 in any way, shape, or form. It's the PQ leader in Quebec, so the separatists have come out against counter tariffs, and the other one is far more expectable but largely irrelevant. That's Maxime Bernier. But there are two people who have understood that counter tariffs are really bad. Tariff is a tax, and it's not a tax on foreigners. It's a tax on people in Canada who consume foreign goods, and in doing that tax, you are increasing the costs of goods and services for them, and that means that they have less to spend in other industries, including Canadian industries, and they will contract. They will be less able to make investment. They will be less able to make hires. And so what you end up with in a war of tariffs and counter tariffs, essentially a downward vicious cycle where everyone gets to be poorer. And it's a horrible policy. It's not the one we should go. The only course forward for Canada, and it's not the first best policy. The first best policy is everyone does free trade at the same time. But the second best is Canada goes alone and it liberalizes on its own. It removes whatever tariffs it has left. It removes non-tariff barriers, and it opens up services in Canada to competition by foreign firms. And it doesn't discriminate according to the flag of those firms, because the only standard of a sovereign and rich nation is competition. And it's competition that enhances productivity, that creates prosperity, and prosperous nations, productive nations, are those that are best able to assert their sovereignties.
I asked Geloso if Canada can actually win a trade war.
We can't win a trade war. So there is work that's been done by other economists that try to estimate how much Canada would have, or how much smaller nations, so not just Canada, how much would they have to put as in terms of tariffs to generate the same damage that larger nations like China or the United States can do, because they're so large. The effect are asymmetrical. That's the idea, is that they can hurt more than we can hurt them. And the reality is, for Canada to match dollar for dollar what the United States are doing, we would need to do 3 times higher tariffs than they are. But for us, it would be not just 3 times more damaging, it would actually grow exponentially. The damages would not be 1 or 2% of GDP, it would be far closer to 10 to 15%. And it's a horrible idea to do this. So when the prime ministers and the premiers are saying stuff like we can match dollar for dollar, that is a blatant lie, a blatant misinformation that has no basis in fact. It has no support in empirical data, in economic theory. There's nothing to back it. Zip, nil, zitch, crap, shit, nothing. There's nothing there. And when they're saying that they can match dollar for dollar, they're lying.
If the U.S. does go ahead with this colossally stupid, self-mutilating plan to impose tariffs on Canada, then we need to be resolute in our response, dollar for dollar retaliation.
It leads the public to thinking that we can have an effect on American policy, which is incorrect. But at the same time, it also assumes that tariffs are good for some reason, and they're good political tool. No, they're not. They are, in the long run, hurting our ability to assert our sovereignty. By making us poorer, we are less able to assert our sovereignty. There are no poor nation that can effectively assert their sovereignty. The effective enforcement of sovereign claims are based on being prosperous. There is no way around it. Anyone else who's saying anything else than that is basically somewhere on the scale between delusion and psychiatric delusion. No nation protectionists its way into prosperity. There is no way to become a rich nation by protectionism. In fact, there's a great paper that I love. It says the 3 guaranteed ways to be a poor nation are war, socialism, and protectionism. Right now, we're saying, let's just do 1/3 of the way on the road to perdition. It's a horrible idea. I can't believe that anyone is taking this seriously.
If tariffs are harmful, then why do our politicians want to impose them in return? Is this just for political gain?
Because many politicians have preference towards protectionism. And the reason why is protectionism generally redistributes to concentrated interest groups, and the costs are paid by a great many people. But since it's divided over a large population, it's not as evident for the majority of people as the regressive redistribution is to the beneficiary. So politicians have an incentive to participate in that game of protectionism, which is why most of the time when you hear politicians say they value tariffs for X or Y or Z reason, it's post facto rationalization. They probably are just looking for a question to an answer that they already had decided upon. And I think it's the same thing also with in Quebec, Premier Legault, in Ontario with Premier Ford. They have stated very strongly protectionist opinions, and they're just using the crisis to do things that they always wanted to do. The only way out is to renew with something that we need to understand has been very much part of the Canadian ethos, which is free trade is good. Free trade is a vehicle for prosperity, and Canada, despite sometimes a wavering belief in free trade, has been one of the most pro-free trade nation in the world. It has been a very strong champion of it. And its championship of free trade has made it into one of the most prosperous nations. The key example of this is if you compare Canada and Argentina at the beginning of the 20th century. Both were equally rich. Both were considered to be the potential champions of the 20th century. And you know what's the difference between the two of them? One of them, by the way, is a rich country now. The other one is not a place that we would consider a rich country. The difference is Canada went full free trade relative to what Argentina did. Argentina went down the road of protectionism. And what you have is a century of relative stagnation for Argentina and actually relative decline for Argentina. Whereas Canada has actually become a rich nation. Not the richest amongst the richest, but one of the richest in the world. And that's because of its commitment to free trade. If we deviate from that, we will lose what makes us a prosperous nation. But since it's something that's been there for a long, long time, it means that it's a reflex that we can reactivate if we talk about it. If we show to people that the damages of protectionism are recessions, are slowdowns in growth, are poorer children, well, I'm sorry, this will leave a memory, and we need to reactivate this, and we need to teach people about the cost of protectionism so that politicians, who are largely reactive creatures more than they are proactive ones, will feel that there are and there will be electoral punishments for engaging in Trump-like protectionism.
I also ask Vincent, if these tariffs are beneficial for the United States, especially since Trump has repeatedly claimed that they will encourage companies and industries to relocate to the U.S.
Here's the thing. Tariffs would actually probably have the adverse effect. So when you raise tariff, you will increase costs to exporters because the dirty sin, the dirty secret of tariffs is a tax on imports, which is what a tariff is, ends up being a tax on exports, because the first effect is you're increasing input costs. So firms that are reliant on goods from abroad, but also techniques from abroad, have to pay more and they're less competitive abroad. So exports will have to fall. Number two is, weirdly enough, if there's not as much imports, when we import from another country, we give dollar bills, and the dollar bills are exports of capital. And if there are fewer American dollars or Canadian dollars on foreign markets, exchange rates will increase, which will further depress exports. So tariffs are self-defeating in and of themselves, and the only thing you end up with is less economic activity.
And the question on everyone's mind, is there a real risk of a recession?
There could be an extreme recession. I think the likeliest scenario is that we'll go on a course of economic development that, if you were to chart on a graph how people's income evolve over time, the slope at which our incomes increase year to year will get slower and slower and slower, so that we will be massively poorer than we could otherwise have been 10, 15, 20 years from now. And it really speaks to what's the true damages of protectionism. The true damages of protectionism is by setting nations on courses that are massively different. And their ultimate cost is, in the interceding period before protectionism is abandoned, is all the lost potential, all the lost prosperity that we could have had earlier. And that's the true cost of protectionism.
Don't forget to go over, and I repeat, calltheelection.ca. This is a way for you to make your voice heard. So go and sign the petition to ask and to strongly request an election right now. We can't wait more longer. We need a strong leader to deal with Donald Trump. So go over, calltheelection.ca.